My father stood in the dead center of the Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom, raised his crystal glass of champagne, and smiled warmly at 300 elite corporate guests. The massive crystal chandeliers overhead cast a brilliant, blinding light across the room, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the designer gowns of the city's top executives. My father cleared his throat, leaned directly into the microphone, and pointed a manicured finger straight toward the back of the room, right where I was standing behind a mahogany reception and coat-check desk. He announced to the entire crowd, with a chuckle dripping with mock fondness, that despite the grand success of the family empire, he was still completely funding my life with his supplementary platinum card. The room instantly filled with polite, muted laughter. People turned around in their cushioned seats to look back at me, their eyes filled with deep, heavy sympathy. My brother Christopher sat at the front VIP table, raising his own glass, a smug, knowing smirk spreading across his face as he locked eyes with me. Beside him, my mother Cynthia leaned back, her diamond necklace catching the light as she beamed with pure, unadulterated pride. They truly believed they were putting me in my place in front of the entire industry. They thought they were reminding me that without their wealth, I was absolutely nothing. What nobody in that glittering ballroom knew was that I hadn't swiped that plastic card for months. In fact, it had been exactly 5 years since I last used it to buy a $4 coffee. I didn't need their supplementary account because I had spent the last 5 years quietly building my own path. And right now, my personal company was generating a 7-figure revenue that completely eclipsed the salary of the brother they worshipped. If you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And I'm always curious, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. My name is Sarah, and standing there in the brilliant glow of the ballroom, listening to the echoes of that polite, superficial laughter, my mind drifted back to the house where I spent 18 years of my life. To anyone on the outside, Henderson Enterprises was a symbol of generational wealth and perfect stability. Inside our home, that wealth was a weapon used to draw a sharp, unyielding line between two completely different worlds. My younger brother, Christopher, was the golden child, the chosen heir groomed from his very first breath to take over the family legacy. On his 18th birthday, my father did not just throw him a massive celebration. He handed him the keys to a brand new $60,000 sports car, parked prominently in our driveway. Christopher had mediocre grades and a history of skipping classes, but his achievements were treated like national holidays, his every mistake excused before he could even apologize. Meanwhile, my world was defined by a completely different set of rules. When I graduated near the absolute top of my high school class, my father glanced briefly at my report card over dinner, muttered a distracted congratulations, and immediately shifted the conversation to Christopher's upcoming golf tournament. When I entered college to pursue a demanding finance degree, there were no keys handed to me, and there was no celebration. While academic scholarships barely covered my tuition, to afford the textbooks and the software licenses required for my courses, I had to take on exhausting weekend shifts at a local diner downtown, scrubbing greasy tables and standing on my feet for 12 hours at a time. Yet, despite providing almost no actual financial support for my education, my parents never missed an opportunity to remind me of how incredibly generous they were being. Every single holiday gathering, every family dinner, my mother Cynthia would sigh heavily and talk about the immense sacrifices they were making just to keep a roof over my head. Looking back now, with the cold clarity of an adult who understands numbers and leverage, I finally see the psychological reality of what they were doing. This was the hidden mechanism of our family dynamic, a structural trap that society rarely talks about. It was the trap of normalized cruelty, wrapped in the language of false benevolence. When parents disguise the bare minimum of providing shelter as an act of extraordinary charity, they are not giving a gift. They are creating an invisible, lifelong ledger of debt. They systematically normalize the idea that your presence is an expensive burden, which forces you to swallow your pride and accept emotional crumbs. By keeping you in a constant state of artificial scarcity, they ensure you remain deeply insecure, rendering you completely dependent on their validation. You are conditioned to believe that you owe them your absolute obedience, your quiet compliance, and your complete identity, just to repay a debt you never actually asked to incur. It is financial abuse disguised as unconditional love, designed to make the victim feel permanently obligated to perform menial labor, just to earn the right to exist within the family unit. I learned that lesson early, so I stopped asking them for anything. I poured all my energy into mastering market analytics, secure algorithms, and capital structures. While Christopher spent his college weekends drinking at expensive beach resorts on my father's dime, I sat alone in my tiny apartment, studying financial data until the sun came up. I built my own security, dollar by single dollar, completely independent of their ecosystem. Then, the planning for the 10-year anniversary gala of Henderson Enterprises began, and the familiar demands started coming my way. The anniversary was not just a corporate milestone. It was designed entirely as a massive showcase for Christopher's supposed genius as the incoming vice president. Christopher demanded an astronomical, unrestricted budget to take over the grandest ballroom at the Grand Plaza Hotel, ordering premium catering, top-tier entertainment, and imported floral arrangements that cost more than my entire college education. Soon my phone rang. It was my father. He didn't waste a single second on small talk or ask how my own career was progressing. He simply stated that I had been deeply disappointing the family lately by missing the preliminary planning meetings. He told me that Christopher was hurt by my cold attitude and that my mother was incredibly stressed. He explicitly paid off the hotel management to dismiss their own coat check staff for the evening, demanding I handle the entire desk alone just to force me into the role of a servant in front of his peers. When I politely hesitated, he lowered his voice, letting the cold steel of threat slip into his tone, reminding me that he could easily revoke my supplementary card and cut me off from the family permanently if I refused to earn my keep. I sat at my desk, looking out at the city skyline, and smiled. They thought they were pulling a string that was still attached to my neck. They had no idea that I had already cut the cord months ago, and that the trap they were setting for me would actually become the stage for their own undoing. When my father made that call, I was sitting in my own office on the 45th floor of a glass tower downtown, reviewing a stack of binding legal documents. I listened calmly as his voice boomed through the speaker, filled with the casual, heavy-handed authority he had used to govern our household for decades. I told him, as evenly as I could, that I would have to decline. I explained that my calendar was completely full because my own firm was in the final, critical stages of closing a $25 million corporate acquisition deal that very week. My father didn't even pause. He let out a sharp, mocking scoff that crackled through the phone line, a sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He told me to stop playing games and inventing fantasy titles to mask my lack of a real career. He said he was utterly tired of my dramatic, ungrateful attitude. Then, he delivered his ultimate decree, the exact same ultimatum he had used whenever he wanted to force my compliance since I was a teenager. He told me that if I did not show up at the Grand Plaza Hotel to support my brother properly, he would call the bank within the hour, cancel my supplementary platinum card, and permanently sever my ties to the family fortune. Sitting there, staring out at the sprawling city below, a cold, quiet realization washed over me. To them, I would always be the struggling, invisible younger sibling who desperately needed their handouts to survive. They were entirely incapable of seeing me as an equal because their own vanity required me to be a failure. I took a deep breath, smiled directly at the empty room, and told him that of course I understood. I agreed to handle the entire registration desk for the gala. The absolute confidence instantly returned to his voice, his ego deeply satisfied because he thought his threat had successfully broken my spirit and forced me back into line. He had absolutely no idea that by demanding my presence, he had accidentally handed me total control of the narrative. The night of the 10-year anniversary gala arrived, and the Grand Plaza Hotel was a spectacle of corporate excess. Valet drivers parked a continuous line of luxury vehicles, while photographers captured images of guests arriving in the marble-lined lobby. I arrived early, dressed in a simple, unbranded black dress that cost less than $100, carrying nothing but a small leather portfolio under my arm. The moment my mother, Cynthia, saw me standing near the mahogany coat check counter, her smile stiffened, and her jaw set in a thin line of deep disapproval. She walked over, smoothed her designer silk wrap, and adjusted her diamond earrings before making a loud, passive-aggressive comment about how it was a shame I hadn't made an effort to look elegant for my brother's most important milestone. She whispered that my cheap wardrobe reflected poorly on the family image, then instructed me to stay behind the desk so I wouldn't embarrass Christopher in front of the key investors. I simply smiled, nodded politely, and took my place behind the counter. For the next 2 hours, I methodically sorted name tags, checked heavy wool coats, and smiled at 300 high-profile guests who barely looked me in the eye. My father walked past the counter multiple times, completely ignoring my presence, entirely consumed with introducing Christopher to every major bank representative in the room. Christopher floated through the crowd like a celebrity, loudly bragging about the upcoming expansion of Henderson Enterprises and the massive contract they were about to secure. They had built a beautiful, flawless fiction for the entire industry to see. Then, around 8 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the lobby slid open, and the senior account manager of Apex Supply Co. marched into the ballroom. He didn't look happy. In fact, his face was flushed with visible frustration, and he bypassed the cocktail bar entirely, walking straight toward my father and Christopher near the main stage. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the mahogany counter, watching the interaction unfold. The ballroom music was loud, but from my position, I could distinctly hear the sharp, agitated tone of the Apex executive. He pulled a folded sheet of financial data from his pocket and thrust it directly toward my father's chest. He demanded to know exactly when Henderson Enterprises intended to settle their massive, long-overdue corporate accounts, loudly stating that his patience had entirely run out. My father frantically tried to lower his voice, his eyes darting around nervously to see if any investors were listening, while Christopher stepped back, his confident posture instantly evaporating into pure panic. I stood behind the reception desk, watching their carefully constructed world begin to crack in real time, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I looked down at the leather portfolio resting securely on my counter. Inside those leather covers were the certified acquisition papers I had signed at exactly 9 o'clock that very morning. Apex Supply Co. wasn't an independent threat to my family anymore. They were a subsidiary of Vanguard Capital, and the furious executive demanding their money didn't realize he was looking at his own brand-new employer standing right across the room. The dinner chimes rang throughout the grand ballroom, signaling the formal portion of the evening. The 300 corporate guests shifted from the cocktail hour into their assigned velvet seats, their diamond bracelets and Rolex watches catching the low, ambient amber light. I stayed exactly where I had been assigned, standing behind the heavy mahogany reception desk at the back of the room, my simple black dress blending into the shadows of the coat check area. The room fell perfectly silent as my father, Robert, stepped up to the main stage, adjusting his silk tie and tapping the microphone with practiced corporate charisma. Christopher sat directly beneath him at the primary VIP table, a look of smug, unearned victory written across his face. My father began his speech by detailing the flawless rise of Henderson Enterprises, projecting massive financial charts onto the screen behind him. He spent 10 full minutes praising Christopher's supposed visionary leadership, attributing our company's survival to his younger brother's brilliant market instincts. The investors nodded approvingly, sipping their vintage wine, completely unaware that Christopher had spent the entire quarter missing deadlines and ignoring supply chain warnings, while I quietly fixed the account structures from my independent firm. Then, exactly as I had anticipated, the tone of my father's voice shifted. He leaned closer to the microphone, a warm, indulgent smile spreading across his face, and turned his gaze directly toward the back of the room where I stood. He mentioned into the microphone that while we were celebrating corporate milestones and ultimate self-sufficiency tonight, we also had to keep our feet on the ground. He looked straight at me and announced to the 300 executives that he was still paying the personal bills of his eldest daughter, keeping her afloat in a difficult economy with his supplementary platinum card. Christopher let out a loud, mocking laugh from the VIP table. My mother Cynthia beamed with performance pride, and the entire room erupted into soft, polite chuckles of secondhand pity. They believed they had successfully trapped me in my role as the dependent, struggling sibling. Instead of shrinking back into the shadows of the coat check closet, I stepped out from behind the mahogany reception desk. The clicking of my heels echoed clearly against the marble floor as I walked down the center aisle, directly toward the main stage. The laughter in the room began to die down, replaced by a sudden, heavy wave of confusion. My father watched me approach, his smile freezing on his face, his hand tightening around the microphone as I climbed the stairs and stepped onto the stage right beside him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't exhibit a single trace of anger. I took the microphone calmly from his hand, turned to face the 300 elite guests, and looked down at my brother Christopher. First, I congratulated Henderson Enterprises on a decade of survival, wishing them luck on the rocky financial quarters ahead. Then, I reached into my small leather portfolio, pulled out the sleek plastic platinum card my father had just boasted about, and placed it flat onto the wooden podium, directly under the bright stage lights. I stated clearly into the microphone that I was deeply surprised to hear so much public concern about my financial dependency tonight. The reason I was surprised, I explained to the completely silent room, is because I haven't swiped that card in exactly 5 years. I watched his smug expression falter as I explained that he was so blinded by his own ego, he never even bothered to check the monthly statements. I detailed into the silence that the very last transaction on that account was a $4 iced coffee I bought on the morning of my final exams, a debt I had repaid in full to my father's bank account the following business day. A few executives in the front row exchanged shocked, uncomfortable glances. My mother's face went completely pale, and my father blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as the narrative of my failure began to collapse in real time. I continued, my tone entirely businesslike and measured. I announced to the investors that after graduating near the top of my finance class, I had founded Vanguard Capital, an independent private equity firm specializing in distressed asset acquisition. I explained that my current career had allowed me to become completely independent, earning a 7-figure revenue that had outpaced the growth of Henderson Enterprises for 3 consecutive quarters. Christopher's face turned an intense shade of crimson, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of his table. I wasn't attacking them. I was simply correcting the fraudulent story they had told about my life to protect their own egos. But I wasn't finished. The real event was about to begin. I reached back into my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick, official manila folder, the ink on the documents inside barely dry. I looked directly at the senior account manager of Apex Supply Co., who was sitting at table 4, watching the stage with an expression of stunned intensity. I revealed to the entire room that Vanguard Capital had closed a $25 million corporate acquisition deal at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. We didn't just invest in the supply chain. We purchased Apex Supply Co. entirely, turning it into a wholly owned subsidiary of my firm. A heavy, suffocating silence spread across the ballroom. I turned to my father, whose breathing had become visibly shallow, and looked down at Christopher. I announced into the microphone that during our standard due diligence audit this afternoon, my legal team had flagged a massive, long overdue account. I stated clearly that Henderson Enterprises currently owed Apex Supply Co. exactly $450,000 in unpaid inventory invoices, a debt that had been neglected for over 6 months, while my brother allocated the capital to fund this very anniversary gala. I placed the manila folder flat onto the podium, right next to the abandoned credit card. I looked at my father and told him that since Vanguard Capital now owned his supplier, that $450,000 debt was legally owed directly to me. I explained that our legal team would be filing a formal notice of default at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning, immediately freezing all their supply credit lines, with absolutely no exceptions for family dynamics. Christopher's hand trembled so violently that his crystal champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering loudly into 100 sharp pieces against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the completely paralyzed room. I left the heavy velvet portfolio and the binding corporate merger documents resting flat on the mahogany podium, turned my back on the stunned silence of the ballroom, and walked out. The glass doors of the Grand Plaza Hotel slid shut behind me, instantly cutting off the suffocating opulence of my family's world. Stepping out into the cool, crisp night air, I took my first deep breath in years. For the first time in my life, the phantom weight of an eternal debt disappeared from my shoulders. I was entirely, beautifully liberated. Months passed like a blur of high-stakes execution. Driven by precision, Vanguard Capital expanded exponentially across the regional market, securing prime asset portfolios and scaling our tech-driven logistics divisions. Meanwhile, inside the crumbling walls of Henderson Enterprises, a completely different reality was unfolding. My brother Christopher's complete lack of supply chain foresight backfired spectacularly, and the company began to suffocate under the strict, uncompromising, and legally binding debt collection terms I had set in motion. The $450,000 balance they owed to my subsidiary wasn't a family dispute anymore, it was a cold corporate default. Late one Friday afternoon, my personal phone lit up with a familiar name. It was my father, Robert. Against my better judgment, I pressed answer. His voice had completely lost the booming, predatory confidence he had used at the hotel podium. He sounded small, strained, and intensely desperate. He skipped the usual lectures and immediately began begging for a family discount, pleading with me to restructure the payment timelines to protect the family name. I didn't argue. I didn't let a single trace of anger enter my voice. I simply told him that Vanguard Capital does not adjust its amortization schedules based on bloodlines, and then I calmly hung up. Within an hour, my assistant permanently routed his number, along with my mother's and Christopher's, directly to our corporate legal department's automated server. They wanted a transaction, and now they had one. Standing at the window of my own boardroom, watching the city lights blink into existence, the final realization settled over me with absolute clarity. True power isn't about screaming for revenge, crashing parties, or matching your abuser's toxicity with your own. True power is about quietly building an empire so massive, so secure, and so undeniably independent that the people who spent decades trying to make you feel worthless can no longer even afford to sit at your table. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever proven toxic family members wrong? I'd love to hear your story.